Hello there, and welcome to this special boring history episode on the rather disturbing lives of the people who used medieval toilets. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, breathe deeply, and let the sounds of the outside world grow faint. The day is done now. Its sharp edges are softening. The hum of life beyond your window has quieted, replaced by the hush of evening. Steady, patient and kind. Perhaps you've never thought much about toilets in history, or perhaps you have, only to shudder and promptly look away. But tonight, we will not turn away. We will go slowly, gently, into the strange, shadowy corners of the medieval world. The corners where business was done, not in bustling market stalls or grand banquet halls, but in privies tucked behind kitchens, under stairwells, or suspended daringly over rushing water. Imagine yourself now, wrapped in the stillness of an old stone village. The year could be 1286, or 1421, or 1377. The night is cool. The scent of wood smoke lingers in the damp air, curling around the low eaves of timber-framed homes. Somewhere nearby, the rhythmic creak of a cartwheel fades into the distance. A dog barks once, then no more, and beneath this sleepy hush, in the narrow alleyways and castle walls, the most private of human routines quietly continue. In the Middle Ages, going to the toilet was rarely a private act. The modern notion of sanitation, plumbing, and modesty was far away, centuries into the future. Instead, the act of relieving oneself was stitched plainly into the rhythm of daily life. Simple, necessary, and for many, dangerous in ways most would never expect. Let's begin with a typical village latrine, though latrine may suggest a level of design it rarely earned. You are in a small rural home. The walls are wattle and daub, patched and repatched over the years. There is no bathroom, of course, no pipes, no porcelain. What you will find is a bucket, wooden, perhaps lined with straw, tucked into a corner, by the back door, or outside altogether, under a crude lean-to. You squat above it, the cool night breeze tugging at your hem, and you do what you must. Later, someone, perhaps you, perhaps a servant or child, will carry that bucket down the lane to empty it into the village cesspit. These pits were simple holes dug in the ground, sometimes ringed with stone, sometimes not. Over time, layers upon layers of waste built up, decomposing slowly and releasing a powerful stench that lingered in the nostrils and clung to the air. In dry seasons, the pit crusted over. In rains, it overflowed, oozing into footpaths and animal pens. And yet, this was simply how it was. Children played nearby. Chickens pecked the ground. Life carried on. In towns, the situation was no better, though far more elaborate. Consider the shared privy of a crowded tenement in London or Paris. Here, a wooden seat was perched over a shaft, sometimes a barrel, sometimes a chute leading to a pit several feet below. The smell rose through floorboards and drifted down alleyways. Waste was collected by night soil men, often under cover of darkness, who would haul it out in carts to be dumped beyond the city walls. Night soil men were paid in coin, but also in curses. Their job was essential, but reviled. They moved among the sleeping, carrying the burden no one wished to acknowledge. They wore thick boots, oil-soaked aprons, and cloths over their mouths. And yet still, many succumbed to disease. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera in later centuries. The work was dirty, yes, but more than that, it was perilous. And then there were the castle privies, ingenious in their way. Known as garderobes, these were narrow chambers built into thick stone walls, often protruding slightly from the edge of the castle itself. You might imagine wrongly that these were private and luxurious, but in truth they were draughty, echoing spaces where the wind howled up from below. You would sit on a cold stone or wooden plank, the hole beneath dropping straight down the outer wall, or into a chute emptying into the moat. Yes, the moat. While you may picture the medieval moat as a clean, defensive ring of water shimmering, beneath drawbridges, it was often little more than a festering trench of refuse and human waste. The stench would rise, particularly in summer, and wrap itself around the castle's foundation. Some castles even had multiple garderobes stacked, one above the other, clever in design, until the upper one leaked into the lower. Danger crept into these spaces in more ways than one. There are records, curious, tragic, and sometimes grimly humorous, of people falling into these chutes. Children, drunkards, even nobility. One tale from 1183 tells of a king's cousin who disappeared during a feast, only to be found hours later, having tumbled into the pit below the garderobe, unable to climb out. He was rescued, covered in filth, and died a week later of illness. Another story, whispered through the centuries, speaks of an assassin who climbed up the waste chute of a castle, dagger in teeth, hoping to strike a lord in the vulnerable moment of his private routine. Whether true or not, it speaks to how permeable these spaces were. No locks, no protection, no true boundaries between inside and out. Even the design of these toilets posed risks. In colder regions, the wooden seats could freeze, causing the skin to stick painfully if one was not careful. Insects swarmed, particularly in summer. Flies, wasps, sometimes rats, drawn by the warmth and waste. And of course, there were the fumes. Methane gas, building silently in cesspits and barrels, could ignite if a candle was brought too close. Some privies exploded. Yes, exploded. One particularly infamous incident occurred in the 12th century in Erfurt, Germany, during a political gathering. Nobles were assembled in an upper chamber when the wooden floor gave way, sending many of them crashing into the latrine pit below. Dozens died, not from the fall alone, but from drowning in the filth, from broken bones, from being crushed beneath others. A grotesque end to what had begun as a day of diplomacy. But not every danger was physical. Some were social, even spiritual. In monasteries, silence was sacred. Monks would enter communal latrines in rows, hoods pulled low, eyes cast down. No talking, no laughing. The act was necessary, but treated with quiet reverence. Water flowed beneath their feet in carefully engineered channels, one of the few places where hygiene was truly considered. Yet even here, a misstep could lead to discipline. Cleanliness was next to godliness, but modesty came before both. And for women, particularly noble women, the situation was more complex still. Chamber pots were common. Ceramic or metal bowls tucked beneath the bed or hidden in an alcove. A servant would remove it, often several times a day. For wealthier women, these pots were sometimes ornate, even painted with pastoral scenes or gilded rims. But function remained unchanged. The act itself, though never spoken of, shaped routines and rituals. Women timed their visits. They avoided certain foods. They trained themselves to endure. In public, women had fewer options. City streets had open drains, yes, but few places where a woman might squat without shame. Some wore special garments, open-crotched underclothes beneath their long dresses, to allow them to relieve themselves discreetly behind a cart or against a wall. Others held on, for hours, for the length of a marketplace visit, until they were home again or somewhere safe. Toilets, or the lack of them, shaped entire cities. Streets were often designed with drainage in mind, sloping gently to allow the rain to wash refuse away. But in dry months, the filth baked onto cobblestones. People walked carefully, shoes scraping through the remnants of others' days. The smell was constant, the awareness inescapable. And yet, this was life. This was normal. You begin to feel it now, don't you? The texture of it, the weight of a world built on quiet necessities. You can almost hear the slosh of buckets, the clink of chamber pots, the murmur of a servant's footsteps in the hallway. You can smell the mix of herbs sometimes tossed into cesspits to mask the odour. Lavender, rosemary, mint, though never quite enough. Night deepens. The stars above this imagined medieval town are dimmed by cloud cover, their light filtered through layers of smoke and mist. A breeze lifts the edge of a tapestry in your mind. Somewhere, a child stirs and returns to sleep. Somewhere, a door creaks open and a figure in a linen nightshirt steps into the cold, carrying a pail. The world of medieval toilets is not grand. It is not gilded, but it is rich with forgotten rhythms. A place where silence was often preferred, but never truly clean. Where necessity shaped invention, and invention faltered against decay. Where dignity was hard won, and privacy even harder. The fire in the hearth is burning low now. Its glow soft and flickering against the wooden beams of the medieval hall. Outside, the night has deepened. The last of the villagers have turned in. The dogs no longer bark. Even the owls have grown quiet. There is only the hush of wind rustling gently through the trees beyond the walls. This is the hour when most sleepers have long since drifted into their dreams. But you, curious soul, are still with us, still wandering slowly through the quieter, earthier side of history. Let's return, then, to the dark corridors and draughty alcoves where the business of the body met the pragmatism of design. We continue where we left off, just past the smell of herbs failing to mask the underlying stench, just beyond the battered doors of village privies and the wind-whistling shafts of stone garderobes. Tonight, you are in a castle again, though not one of royalty. This is a modest stronghold, owned by a lesser noble, perhaps a baron, or a knight with land granted after years of service. The keep is cold, even in summer. The stone floors are slick with condensation, and the walls are thick, built for defense, not comfort. Somewhere above, a tapestry flutters as a breeze moves through the arrow slits. You can hear the clink of a chainmail hauberk being hung by the fire, and the soft, irregular tread of tired feet. The garderobe here is more of a narrow shaft, tucked behind a wooden door no taller than a man's shoulder. The passage is lit only by a single candle set into the wall. Wax drips slowly down its side, and the flame shudders with each draught. You step in carefully. The air smells faintly of damp limestone, moss, and something deeper, fouler. Below, the shaft drops several stories. There's no guardrail, no safety, only the void. You sit slowly, thoughtfully. The stone is shockingly cold. You do your business, and as you rise, you think of those who sat here before you. Not just today, or this month, but years past. The same stone, the same draught, the same resignation. Servants may have lined the shaft with rushes now and then, dry, grasses mixed with herbs to absorb odours and soak up mess. Sometimes those rushes were burned, but more often they simply piled up, layer after sour layer. If the shaft emptied into the moat, then it might wash away with the next rain. But if it collected into a pit, then eventually it would need to be cleared. And how did they clear it? Enter the gong farmer, a profession so uncelebrated, so avoided in conversation, and yet absolutely essential to life in towns and castles. The word gong once meant to go, and so a gong farmer was one who dealt with that which had gone. They were men mostly, and they worked under cover of night. Their job was to climb down into the cesspits beneath the castle or city, knee-deep or worse in human waste, and shovel it out into barrels. This work was not done often. Some pits were left to fill for years. By the time a gong farmer was summoned, the waste was a towering mound of crusted filth and fermenting decay. The farmer would lower himself slowly, oil lamp tied around his neck, eyes half shut against the sting. His boots would sink into the mess, and there he would begin, shovel by shovel, hour after hour. The smell was said to cling to them for days, no matter how often they bathed. They were paid well, more than most labourers, in fact, but they were shunned. People crossed the street to avoid walking near them. They could not enter churches. They were discouraged from marrying within their parish. Their job was necessary, but they themselves were treated as unclean. In this way, medieval society managed its discomfort by placing the burden of cleanliness onto a few, and then exiling them from polite company. Still, the gong farmers laboured on, their torches flickering deep beneath the stones, their movements silent as the city slept. They left before dawn, and no one spoke of them. But even they, the most seasoned of pit workers, knew fear. Some cesspits were deeper than expected. Some were unstable, the walls ready to collapse. Others filled with poisonous gas, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide. Many gong farmers died underground, their bodies found only days later when their replacements came looking. Imagine it now, the soundless fall of a body into a pit of waste, the sudden extinguishing of a lamp, the quiet rush of gas building unseen. There were no alarms, no rescue teams, just stillness. And then a new layer added to the pit below. Back in the castle above, those who used the garderobe never saw this. They did not know the name of the man who cleaned their waste. They only knew the relief of emptying their bowels, the fleeting comfort of being done, the satisfaction of closing the heavy wooden door and returning to their woolen beds. Outside, the world remained equally unforgiving. In cities, people emptied their chamber pots directly into the streets. There were laws against this, yes, but they were rarely enforced. The rules stated you must call out before dumping. Something like, Gardez-l'eau, a warning derived from the French Gardez-l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. But often people dumped without warning. You walk now through such a street, slowly, carefully. The cobbles are slick with rain, and more than rain. You keep to the edges near the buildings, though even here the refuse clings in the crevices. Wooden planks serve as makeshift walkways. Rats dart between shadows. A stray dog noses at a heap of rotting straw. Above you, windows creak open and shut. A bucket tips. You step aside just in time. This was not unusual. This was every morning, every street, every city, and with such waste came sickness. Typhus, dysentery, fevers with no name. In cities where hundreds shared the same cesspools, the spread of disease was inevitable. And yet, people continued, because there was no alternative. You might dig a pit outside your home, but your neighbour would dig one too, and before long the earth itself would be soured. There were, however, efforts, clumsy, early but sincere. Some towns instituted street cleaners, paid by the guilds to shovel refuse to the outskirts. Others created gong farms, fields specifically designated for waste, far from the town centre. A few cities experimented with covered drains, though they clogged often and required constant clearing. And still, at the heart of it all, was the problem of the toilet itself. Too public or too private, too close or too far, too simple or too dangerous. You find yourself now in a monastery, a Benedictine abbey perhaps. The monks here have rules, rigid, unchanging. They rise at the same hour each day. They pray in the same hall. They walk in silence. And they relieve themselves in a structure called the Reredoter. The Reredoter is a long room built behind the dormitory, suspended over a channel of running water. Dozens of holes line its wooden bench, each spaced at even intervals. The monks come here quietly, hoods drawn. They do not speak. They do not meet each other's eyes. Some bring books, religious texts meant to keep the mind above base matters. Beneath the Reredoter, the stream flows steadily, though its purity is questionable. Bits of linen float on the surface, leaves and scraps of food. It's meant to wash everything away, but the water is shallow and the slope is imperfect. The monks know this, but accept it. Here, at least, there is some rhythm. A place set aside, a place understood. Elsewhere, the rhythm is less gentle. In inns and taverns, the toilet might be a communal trough behind the building, open to sky and wind. In towns, public latrines existed, but were few and far between. Travellers often used hedges, streets, ditches, sometimes a friend's doorstep. And through all this, the fear remained, the quiet, persistent fear of what might go wrong. You see it in the eyes of a mother cautioning her child to hold their breath when passing the cesspit, in the careful steps of an old man avoiding a cracked lid on a street barrel, in the whispered story of the merchant who disappeared during a thunderstorm, last seen near the edge of a bridge where a toilet emptied into the river. Yes, there were toilets built over rivers. They were considered luxurious by some. The current carried everything away. No pit to clean, no smell to linger. But these too held dangers. The wood would rot, the foundations would crumble, People slipped and vanished into the dark water, their fates carried downstream. And so we return to the core truth of medieval toilets. They were necessary, yes, but never safe. They were unglamorous, forgotten, and yet ever present. They were places of relief, of routine, and of risk. Every household had one. Every person needed one. And yet, no one wished to speak of them. But we do, because even in their grimy corners, even in their sour smells and dangerous drops, they speak of how people lived, how they endured, how they tried, however imperfectly, to bring order to the messiness of life. The candle in your imagined chamber burns low now. Its wax has pooled in a crooked oval at the base. Somewhere nearby, a servant carries out a pot. Somewhere else, a door creaks open to a chilly shaft. And outside, the wind has begun to pick up again. The wind hums low tonight, a gentle moan across the eaves of stone and timber. The fire has gone out entirely now, leaving only a faint trace of warmth in the air, and a whisper of smoke that clings to the heavy fabrics of tapestries and cloaks. All around, the world has grown even quieter. No footsteps, no carts, no whispers from behind thick doors. Only stillness, deep, slow, and patient. And in that stillness, the world of waste and water, the most unspoken part of medieval life, still murmurs beneath the surface, still waits in the dark. Let us walk now beyond the castle and the town, beyond the courtyard drains and the monastic troughs. Let us drift into the surrounding countryside where most people lived, not in stone fortresses or city tenements, but in modest huts scattered along dirt roads, nestled between hedgerows, fields, and wooded glades. You are one such villager tonight, perhaps a weaver, or a simple crofter with a garden of turnips and a few clucking hens. Your home is humble, walls of wattle and daub, a roof of thatch now slick with evening dew. Inside it is dim. A small hearth smoulders, giving off more smoke than heat. A pot hangs above the ashes, thick with yesterday's porridge, and in the back corner of this one-room home, behind a curtain, if you're fortunate, sits the family's closest thing to a toilet. A bucket, wooden lined with straw, or a cloth if you're careful. A chamber pot, perhaps, if you have a bit more coin. It is emptied each morning, down the slope behind the house, where nettles grow thick and tall. Sometimes you throw the contents directly into the pigsty. The animals don't seem to mind. This system is crude, yes, but it is ordinary. Everyone does it. No one speaks of it. The stench is familiar, present but background, like the scent of wet wool or onion soup. You grow used to it. You stop noticing, and yet even here danger lingers, especially in the warm months. The waste behind your cottage draws flies, swarms of them. They buzz around the slop heap, then into your home. They settle on bread, on wounds, on babies' faces. Disease travels with them, quietly, invisibly. What begins as a mild stomachache might end in fever, in delirium, in a funeral procession winding slowly through the village lane. People whisper theories. Some blame bad air, others the phases of the moon. Still others mutter about witches, about spirits offended by the way refuse was tossed into streams or buried in shallow graves. They are wrong, of course, but their fears are not without foundation. There are also those who try to do better. In some villages, elders designate a specific area for waste. They dig trenches and teach the younger ones to avoid polluting the Eidger. Well, they burn the old rushes from the floors. They spread ash to mask the smell. These are early instincts, hints of future sanitation, but they are fragile. One careless act undoes weeks of care. One flood carries it all back again. And then there is rain. Rain in the medieval countryside is both a blessing and a curse. It waters the fields, it fills the barrels, it washes the filth from the lanes. But it also stirs the ground, spreads the muck, overflows the pits dug behind houses. When the heavy summer rains come, they churn the contents of every ditch and trench into a soup that seeps into the earth, into shoes, into food stores, into dreams. You rise one morning after such a rain. The chickens are quiet. The pigsty is half submerged in muck. Your waste trench has collapsed entirely. You see it there, raw and open. The contents spread into the herb garden, tainting the parsley and thyme. There is nothing to do but start again. Dig a new trench. Boil the water. Hope, and this hope, quiet, repetitive, and necessary, is what kept medieval life turning. Even as toilets failed, even as waste piled high. Not far from your village is a manor house. Not quite a castle, but grander than anything you've known. Stone built, 2 stories high. It belongs to a minor lord, someone with just enough influence to own land and servants, but not enough to escape the mess of the world. He, too, must go, and he, too, has a latrine. His, however, is known as a close stool. A wooden chair with a hole in the seat beneath which rests a ceramic bowl. It is carried to him, placed by the bed. Often in the morning, a servant arrives, quietly, eyes lowered, to remove it, clean it, and carry it away. In noble households, this servant had a title, the groom of the stool. Yes, a real title, and a highly trusted one, especially in royal households, where the groom of the stool was often a confidant, privy, quite literally, to the king's most private moments. He monitored the monarch's diet, examined the waste for signs of illness, and handled the logistics of the king's daily health. A strange honour, perhaps, but in a world where health was fragile and privacy rare, the one who managed the royal bowels held power, quiet power. Of course, the lord of this manor is no king. His stool is simple, the bowl unadorned. But even so, his servants speak of him with a kind of fearful respect. They tip the contents of his chamber pot far from the house, into a trench behind the stables, or if it's raining, into the stream that winds through the fields. And so the stream becomes a carrier of waste, of whispers, of sickness. It winds through the land like a thread, stitching together the lives of noble and peasant alike. At times, the water looks clean, clear enough to drink, cool and inviting on a warm spring morning. Children splash in it. Women wash linens there. Horses drink from it. And yet, upstream, someone may have just emptied their pot. You never truly know. In towns, this uncertainty only grows. We walk now through another city. The stone streets are wet with dew, though it hasn't rained. That dew is not just from the air. It is a mixture of condensation, runoff, and the refuse of thousands. Look there, a wooden building leaning precariously over the street, its second story jutting out above the thoroughfare. On its side, a chute called a garderobe chute, through which the inhabitants toss their waste directly into the alley below. The chute has splashed onto the stone wall. Flies cluster where the liquid meets the cobblestones. A man walks by, covering his nose. A woman lifts her skirts. A dog sniffs, then scampers away. This is not rare. This is every day. Some cities try to cope. They issue ordinances. You must shout before dumping. You must clean your street on Sundays. You must not let your cesspit overflow. But people forget, or they ignore the rules, or they cannot afford to do better. Cesspits beneath the homes, when they exist, are often too shallow. Some are merely barrels buried in the ground, lined with stones barely containing the flow. Others are open holes with a wooden lid. One wrong step in the dark, and you're in. Literally. There are accounts of just such things. People falling in, breaking a leg, or worse. One tale speaks of a baker's apprentice in York who vanished during an early morning walk to the market. His body was found days later, wedged in the overflow drain of a public toilet. But it wasn't just the accidents. It was the silence. The Tuchens, shame. Even then, people were embarrassed by the topic. They avoided speaking of it, avoided acknowledging what everyone did every day. The more refined one's status, the more effort was spent pretending. A noble might use a perfumed handkerchief. A priest might light incense near the church latrine. A merchant's wife might sprinkle lavender in her pot. But the truth remained. Beneath every layer of wealth, of cloth, of pride, there was the same smell. It clung to the streets, to the stones, to memory. And even now, centuries later, that memory lingers in the archaeology beneath our feet. In excavations across Europe, archaeologists have uncovered medieval toilets, deep shafts filled with not just human waste, but objects, bones, buttons, hairpins, toys. Some of these things were dropped by accident, others perhaps on purpose, tossed away in shame or hidden in the dark. Each item tells a story. A child's doll lost to the depths, a broken ring, a spoon. Even old manuscripts have been found, repurposed as wiping cloth, pages of prayer books, now stained and silent. You close your eyes now, and you can almost feel it. The damp chill of stone beneath your feet, the flicker of a lantern, the sigh of wind through a wooden door. Somewhere, someone shifts in sleep. Somewhere else, someone tiptoes to a dark corner with a bucket. The world is still turning. Quietly, messily, beautifully human. The candle has burned halfway down now, its stubby wick glowing faintly in the draughty stillness of your imagined chamber. A hush lies over everything, not just outside, but deep inside too, as if even your thoughts have settled into a gentle rhythm, like footsteps in soft mud or the muffled swish of water passing through a village ditch. You are safe here, wrapped in the quiet folds of time. The world may be dim, and yes, unpleasant in the places we visit, but here, in the glow of slow history, discomfort becomes distance. We are only visitors. We observe, then drift gently on. Tonight, we turn our gaze towards the humblest of tools. They are things so ordinary, so forgettable, that few ever thought to write them down. The wiping cloth, the rush, the sponge on a stick, the water scoop. After all, using a toilet, whatever form it took, was only part of the experience. The rest, the cleaning up, was another layer of daily risk and ritual. In the modern world, we take softness for granted. Folded paper in neat rolls, perfumed and bleached. But in the medieval world, wiping was an act shaped by what was near, what was available, and what would not be missed. In the countryside, that often meant moss, soft, springy, slightly damp. If you lived near woods or stream beds, you could gather it easily. Sometimes leaves were used, though not all leaves were created equal. The wise learned quickly which ones were forgiving, and which had edges or oils that brought regret. In towns and castles, the cloth was more common, scraps of linen, washed and reused. These cloths were not private. In large households or communal monasteries, they were shared, hung by the garderobe wall or placed in a corner. When soiled, they were rinsed in a bucket of water, sometimes with ash or lye, and set out to dry. Monasteries, in particular, had detailed systems for this. The reredoter, that long, echoing latrine behind the dormitory, often had a lavatory space nearby, where monks would wash themselves after relieving their bowels. They used water scoops, drawn from channels that flowed beside the main stream, and wiping cloths that were hung out in rows like laundry. Some were even given personal cloths, numbered or marked with simple signs. But not all wiping materials were kind. In cities, paper was a luxury. The earliest medieval paper was made from pulped linen rags, and it was precious, used for contracts, for letters, for sacred books. No one wasted paper on something so base. Or at least, not until that paper was already old, damaged, or longer needed. That brings us to an unsettling truth. In some cases, discarded manuscript pages were reused in the latrine. A scribe's draft, a student's notes, a misprinted page from a psalter. These sheets would be torn and repurposed, used to wrap food, line a box, or serve in the garderobe. Archaeologists have found fragments of religious texts in the bottom of cesspits, their Latin prayers barely legible through the stains of time. And in castles by the sea, something even stranger was used. Sponge sticks, borrowed perhaps from the Roman tradition. The sponge on a stick made its way into some medieval coastal communities, where sea sponges were easy to gather, soft when wet, and reusable. They were kept in pots of vinegar or salt water, rinsed after each use. Communal, yes. Hygienic, perhaps not, but practical, undeniably. Still, there were risks. One wrong sponge, one dirty cloth, one unwashed scoop, and sickness could begin. Skin infections, ulcers, rashes that never healed. Open sores became infected, and when that happened, treatment was rudimentary. Honey and ash, mud and mint. The village healer might apply a poultice and whisper a prayer, but often the wound lingered, festering in silence. What began as a moment of poor wiping could, weeks later, end in fevered dreams. Some people, unable to bear the discomfort, tried not to go at all. They ate less, or fasted, or simply endured the cramps until the pain passed. Constipation was common, especially during winter months, when movement slowed and the cold made every step outside an ordeal. And this brings us to the question of location once more. Where did people go when nature called in the night? For most villagers, it meant stepping outside with a pot or a bucket. Some had outhouses, small wooden sheds perched above shallow trenches. But in heavy rain or deep snow, these were avoided. Instead, you used a chamber pot by the hearth. You squatted over the ashes. You whispered apologies to the gods or saints, if you believed in such things. In noble homes, night stools were kept beside the bed. Some even had curtains around them, illusion of privacy, even in a shared chamber. Servants were trained not to look. Some were even tasked with holding scented cloths while their masters relieved themselves. And yes, these acts were witnessed, not always directly, but often enough. Privacy, as we know it, was rare. Entire families shared a single room. In busy towns, strangers might sleep side by side in an inn, with only a few inches between them. You went when you could. You turned your back. You listened to the wall. The smells were impossible to ignore. In the morning, the air inside a peasant's home was thick with breath, damp clothes, and the acrid tang of waste. You lit a rushlight. You opened the door to let it out. You swept the floor with a bundle of twigs and hoped for a breeze. But even amid this, people sought small comforts. Women burned herbs, lavender, sage, rosemary, bundled in cloth or placed in pots near the bed. Some wore pouches of dried flowers around their necks. Men chewed mint leaves or cloves before entering a shared chamber. These efforts didn't remove the smell, but they softened it, and in the wealthiest of homes, new ideas began to stir. By the late medieval period, some manor houses began experimenting with what we might recognize, just barely, as indoor plumbing. Lead pipes, risky though they were installed in a few rare estates. Rainwater was channeled into underground tanks. Latrine shafts were lined with glazed tiles. Chutes were designed to carry waste away, with minimal smell. These were rare, expensive, often unstable. But they hinted at a desire to make the necessary less unpleasant, to separate the body's mess from the rest of life, to make space for dignity. And even in cities, slow change crept in. Some town councils built public latrines, brick structures along rivers, with seats and screens for privacy. A few were even gendered, with separate spaces for men and women. Fees were collected, cleaners were hired. But maintenance was a challenge. People misused them. Thieves hid in them. Drunks fell asleep on their benches. And the rivers, those ancient arteries of commerce and waste, grew ever fouler. Fish died. Crops watered downstream withered. Priests warned against drinking from certain wells. Rumors spread about curses, about poisoned springs, about the devil in the drain. But the truth always was simpler. There were too many people, and too much waste, and no system strong enough to carry it all away. And so, for most, life remained what it had always been. A dance around discomfort. A delicate balance between need and risk, between shame and necessity. You imagine now a woman rising before dawn, her feet bare on the packed earth floor. She lifts her skirts. She crouches above the chamber pot. The fire is not yet lit. The room is dark. Her breath clouds the air. Says nothing. Later, her husband will carry the pot to the edge of the garden, as he always does. He will toss its contents into the compost heap. He will rinse it with the rain barrel. He will return it without comment, and life will go on. Across centuries, across kingdoms, the routine continues. Children squirming in cold nightshirts, old men coughing as they make their way to the outhouse, servants lifting heavy pails, street cleaners muttering to themselves. 1,000 hands doing the work no one speaks of, but all depend on. Even now, in museums and beneath modern buildings, their work remains. Latrine pits filled with broken pottery, buttons, teeth, seeds from long-forgotten meals. Fossilized layers of what once was discarded, now the clearest window into how they lived. The night has stretched long and thin, like a thread drawn taut between two distant candle flames. The air around you is still, the kind of deep whispering stillness that only arrives in the hours before dawn. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the faraway drip of water from a cracked gutter, or the soft rustle of straw as someone turns in their sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster stirs too early, then settles again, as if realizing the world isn't quite ready to wake. And you, still warm beneath your blanket, still tucked safely in your bed, are drifting gently with us, deeper into the underworld of medieval sanitation. You've seen the buckets and the garderobes, the pits and the peril. But the world of waste was not just physical, it was social. It shaped status. It separated the low from the high, the visible from the invisible, the powerful from the ones who quietly carried away what others left behind. Tonight, let us return to the medieval city, not through its winding alleys or crooked doorways, but from below. Beneath the cobbled streets, beneath the markets and inns and stone facades of townhouses, lie the hidden veins of the city. Drains, channels, culverts carved in stone or laid in timber, meant to carry away not only rainwater, but everything else that didn't belong. These early sewer systems were often built by hand, dug with wooden spades, shaped with flat stones, and left open in places to catch the flow. At first glance, they seemed clever, progressive even, but they were only as clean as their users, and medieval users, for all their good intentions, were limited by understanding, resources, and necessity. These channels quickly became clogged. Bits of straw, broken bones from the butcher's shop, kitchen scraps, wool clippings, hair, soot, and more, all found their way in. Wastewater backed up into courtyards. The stench rose into sleeping chambers. Rats followed the scent, bold and fat from their nightly feasts, nesting in the warm gaps between floorboards and rafters. Cities like London, Paris, and Cologne tried to improve things. Ordinances were passed. Laws were written in elegant script and nailed to the walls of public buildings, forbidding residents from dumping refuse into the streets. But the streets themselves were often designed to carry it away. Many had a central channel, a slight dip running down the middle, essentially an open gutter, intended for rain to wash away the daily filth. People swept their trash into it. Toilets emptied directly into it. And so it flowed downhill, slowly, sluggishly, towards the rivers. The rivers, of course, were lifelines, used for drinking, bathing, washing clothes and feeding livestock. And yet, they were also the city's final toilet. Everything ended up there. The Thames, the Seine, the Rhine. Wide and glittering from a distance, they were often fouled at the edges, their surfaces rippling with oily streaks and floating debris. On hot days, the smell was overwhelming. Bakers near the river wore cloths over their mouths. Fishmongers soaked their wares in tubs of vinegar to mask the odour. And still, people drank from these rivers. They had no choice. Wells existed, yes, but if you lived near a cesspit, your well water was likely tainted. The earth could only filter so much. A heavy rain might carry filth down into the water table. A poorly dug pit might leak into the neighbour's yard. And so people lived surrounded by danger, unseen, unnamed, but always present. When illness struck, it often began quietly. A bad stomach, a fever, a sudden weakness in the limbs. Mothers noticed it first in their children. Sunken eyes, dry lips, the way they no longer played in the dirt. The healer was called, a woman or man with a basket of dried herbs and gentle hands. A poultice was made, a prayer was whispered, but the cause remained a mystery. They blamed spoiled meat, the position of the stars, an ill word spoken in anger. But always, beneath it all, the filth remained. The layer no one could see, but all could smell. And those who lived with it most intimately, the street cleaners, the gong farmers, the latrine, servants, were both feared and forgotten. In many towns, the position of waste cleaner was assigned to the poorest, the lowest ranking, the most marginalized. Some were criminals, offered lighter sentences in exchange for service. Others were simply desperate for work. They dressed in rough wool soaked in oil or pitch to keep out the wet. They wore gloves of leather or nothing at all. They carried long-handled scoops and thick sacks. And they moved by night, their shadows, flickering by torchlight as they hauled away the city's secrets. Sometimes they were thanked. More often, they were cursed. If a cleaner left behind a smell, a smear, or a stain, they were fined. If someone slipped and fell on a mist patch of refuse, the cleaner was whipped. And yet, when these workers went on strike, as they sometimes did, life ground to a halt. No one wanted to admit it, but these were the keepers of order. The invisible, guards against collapse. In the wealthiest homes, cleanliness was a kind of performance. Noble ladies wore perfumed gloves, laced with rose oil or crushed cloves, to ward off unpleasantness. Gentlemen carried pomanders, small carved orbs filled with scented herbs, dangling from their belts or tucked into sleeves. Rooms were strewn with rushes, sprinkled with lavender, orris root, and marjoram. And yet, beneath every velvet curtain and silk sheet, the truth remained. The chamber pots still filled. The servants still carried them out. The garderobes still needed scraping. The pits still filled to the brim. Even kings could not escape it. There are records of monarchs caught in embarrassing moments, relieving themselves during hunts or in field tents during war, only to have the waste carried away by trembling pages. Henry VIII had a close stool made of velvet and brass. Queen Elizabeth of France kept her own perfumed cloths, but all of them, no matter how high their throne, had to sit and wipe and wonder. And still the world spun on. In monasteries, a different approach emerged. Cleanliness not as luxury, but as discipline. The rule of St. Benedict laid out routines. Washing, prayer, fasting, and yes, even the use of the latrine. Monks washed their hands and faces after defecating. Some wore special garments, simple washable linen robes called subligacula, to preserve modesty and ease of cleaning. And yet even here, Perfection was elusive. Monks fell ill. Latrines overflowed. Rats chewed through the thatch. There was no escaping it, only enduring it. And so, over time, people developed their own rituals. Not formal, not written, but passed down like lullabies and family recipes. A mother teaching her daughter how to fold the cloth just so, to avoid staining her hem. A farmer showing his son where to dig the next trench, far enough from the cabbage patch this time. A servant learning when to empty the pot, never after supper, always before guests arrived. Tiny lessons, quiet customs, a kind of unspoken wisdom built around the rhythms of waste, and with it came an odd kind of grace, to accept the mess, to live with it, to find peace not by erasing the body, but by acknowledging it. That is what medieval people did. Day after day, season after season, they cleaned, they carried, they bore the weight of their waste, not just physically, but spiritually. And if you listen closely, through the walls of time, you can still hear them. The rustle of skirts lifting in the dark, the splash of water in a stone trough, the steady shuffle of a cleaner's feet along the alley. These are not glamorous sounds, but they are deeply human, and they deserve to be remembered. The candle now is nothing but a stub, curled at the base of the holder. The room is darker, quieter, though night has gathered fully around you, wrapping the world in its softest cloth. The hour now is so deep it no longer seems to belong to today or yesterday. It drifts somewhere in between, like mist in a forgotten courtyard, or the memory of footsteps long vanished from the stone. If your eyes were open, you might imagine you saw the flicker of a torch through the hallway, or a servant slipping quietly through a doorway with a chamber pot held carefully in both hands. But no one is there, only the soft hum of breath and the weightless drift of history wrapping around you like a blanket. We've wandered together through castles and cottages, manors and monasteries, streets and sewers. But what of those places in between? The stopping points, the waiting rooms of the medieval world. Tonight, let us step into the quiet edges of travel and public life. Let us find ourselves in inns, at markets, in way stations, and on pilgrimage routes, where people from all walks of life found themselves faced with the same quiet question. Where can I go? You are a traveller tonight, cloaked in damp wool, your boots crusted with mud from the road. You've walked for hours, perhaps days, along winding country lanes, past fields where sheep graze lazily, past woods where the trees whisper like old friends. The wind has shifted, and a storm is threatening. You find yourself approaching an inn, timber-framed, with smoke curling from its chimney, its shutters rattling slightly in the breeze. The scent of boiled cabbage and ale reaches your nose. Inside, the warmth embraces you instantly. The hearth glows with orange coals. A dog thumps its tail lazily near the door. There is the clink of mugs, the hum of a lute in the far corner, and the murmur of weary voices. Merchants, peddlers, farmers, and a friar or two, all with dust still clinging to their cloaks. But even in this comfort, nature cannot be ignored for long. After food and drink, after rest, comes the inevitable need. You ask quietly. The innkeeper gestures to the back. Behind the inn, beyond the stables, stands a small, rough-shod structure. A privy, nothing grand. A wooden shed, leaning slightly to one side, its door hanging on tired hinges. Inside, a plank with a hole. Beneath it, a trench. A few dried rushes have been tossed in. A scrap of cloth hangs on a peg. The air is thick with the smell of rot and damp wood. It's not pleasant, but it's something. And for many, it was far better than nothing at all. Travel in the Middle Ages was often uncertain. Roads were poor. Weather was capricious. Bandits lurked in forests, and wolves were not yet just stories. But beyond those fears lay the quiet, persistent discomfort of not knowing where relief could be found. Inns varied wildly in quality. Some had privies like this one. Others had none at all. You might be told to use the hedgerow, or a corner of the field, or to walk out past the third fence by the sheepfold. You'd nod and obey, and hope you weren't seen. For women, this was especially difficult. There were no locks, no screens. Modesty was maintained only by distance and the speed of the act. And if one was travelling alone, or worse, sick, it became a small agony to find a moment of privacy. Some women carried cloaks designed to spread around them as they crouched. Others learned to wait until darkness. In larger towns, they might pay a coin to use the facilities of a church or a guild hall. But even these could be crude, shared, noisy, and unclean. Markets offered more opportunity, but not necessarily more comfort. Imagine now a bustling village fair. The morning is already warm. Vendors have arrived early, setting up stalls of dried fish, cured meat, cloth, candles, and sweet wine. Chickens scuttle beneath carts. Children dart between legs. The air smells of sweat and herbs and roasting nuts. And somewhere amid all this, you need to go. You look around. There is no designated spot. Not really. Perhaps a few barrels behind the tannery, or a hidden corner behind the chapel wall. Sometimes a makeshift trench is dug by the edge of the field, screened by blankets or cart sides. But most simply find a place as best they can. There is no schedule, no signage, only habit and hope. The church may have a latrine, a narrow room tucked near the cloister, reserved for clergy and choir boys. But not for you. The baker's apprentice may share a pot with 3 others behind his tent. The town bailiff may have a proper close stool carried in a cart. But you, again, must adapt. This adaptability was crucial in medieval life. For all the strictness of feudal hierarchy, the needs of the body had to bend to the reality of the moment. A noble might share a hedge with a peddler if the road was long enough. A monk might squat behind a stone wall if the refectory was locked. Still, attempts were made, even amid chaos, to create systems. Some towns created public latrines, especially during large festivals or holy days when crowds gathered. These were wooden huts perched over barrels or streams. Men and women might be separated by a canvas screen. An attendant might be present, often a child or a beggar, who would ask for a small fee or offer a cloth. But these structures were not always maintained. They overflowed, they stank. Some became dangerous, attracting pickpockets or worse. And many simply crumbled from use and neglect. Pilgrimage routes had their own rituals. As you walk again, this time along the road to Canterbury or Santiago or Rome, you fall in step with other pilgrims. A blacksmith, a widow, a knight with a limp. You trade stories, share bread, and quietly you ask about the next resting place. Along the path, hospices and priories sometimes offer shelter. They have their own reredaughters, their own routines. You are given a corner to sleep in, a bowl of broth, and, if you are lucky, a place to relieve yourself with some measure of dignity. But often it's just the field again. You choose your spot with care, away from the campfire. Behind a rise, you carry a cloth, a bottle of water, perhaps a pinch of ash for cleaning. You say a short prayer. You return without comment. For this too became part of the pilgrim's humility, accepting discomfort, enduring with patience, letting go of shame. And in a way, the very lack of facilities became its own equalizer. A bishop and a beggar, both walking the same road, would eventually crouch behind the same wall. A queen and a washerwoman, caught in a sudden storm during a journey, might both find themselves wishing for the same rough plank. The world did not care for rank in these moments. It simply demanded adaptation. And yet, even here, people tried to leave things better than they found them. Some carried lime or ash to scatter over waste. Others built small fences of twigs to mark latrine spots. Monastic orders wrote manuals advising pilgrims to dig small pits, to avoid waterways, to not leave mess where others might step. A quiet etiquette of the road evolved, not enforced by law, but by shared understanding. And so, medieval travel became a dance between movement and pause, between public spaces and private needs. People moved slowly, with awareness, with patience. They did not expect comfort, but they hoped for decency. And every innkeeper who kept the trench cleared, every pilgrim who buried their waste with care, every servant who swept the latrine with a bundle of rushes, they all contributed to this quiet, ongoing effort to live, with the body's needs in a world that rarely made room for them. Even now, if you close your eyes, you might imagine their efforts. A woman scrubbing the wood floor with vinegar and rosemary, a stable boy pouring warm water into a basin behind the inn, a young monk folding a cloth and setting it aside with care. These were small acts, forgotten by most. But they mattered, because in the end, the story of medieval toilets is not just about waste, or danger, or discomfort. It is about people trying to stay clean in a dirty world, trying to preserve dignity amid mud and mess. Trying, always, to make life just a little more bearable, for themselves, for others, for the ones who would come next. The hush of night lies thick as wool now, deep and undisturbed, wrapping your thoughts in soft folds, as if time itself has paused to listen. The candle in your imagined room is but a faint ember, its flame no longer needed. The world outside, your window has quieted completely. No carts, no dogs barking, no voices calling in the dark, just the occasional creak of old wood settling, and the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. You've wandered far already, through fields and forests, alleys and abbeys, in search of a most humble but essential thread in history. And now we arrive in a place where cleanliness became not just a practicality, but a ritual, a sign of sanctity, of preparation, of respect. Let us now step quietly into the world of medieval hospitals and leper houses, the places where the body, wounded or diseased, was cared for with slow reverence and often, surprisingly, thoughtful sanitation. Close your eyes. and you are there. You stand in a long stone hall lined with narrow beds, each with a thin woolen blanket tucked neatly over its occupant. The scent is not unpleasant, more herbal than foul. A hint of rosemary, maybe, mint, dried chamomile. At the far end of the hall, a great arched window lets in the moonlight, casting a faint silver glow over sleeping forms. You hear the light clang of a pot being set down, the swish of a broom, and the quiet hum of a nurse, humming a hymn under her breath as she folds a cloth. This is a medieval hospital, not a place for surgery, as we might think of today, but a place of rest, of care, of waiting. The hospitals of the medieval world were deeply religious institutions, run mostly by monks, nuns, or religious laypeople. Their main purpose was to offer comfort, food, warmth, and cleanliness to those in need, especially the poor, the dying, and the infirm. They could be found across Europe, often near monasteries, abbeys, or cathedrals. And in these places, toileting was managed with a gentler touch than one might expect. The sick were not expected to trek outside to a privy in the cold night air. They were provided with close stools, wooden chairs with removable pots beneath, or chamber pots tucked under the bed. Some hospitals even had indoor privy systems, with built-in drains leading to cesspits outside the main building, lined with stone or brick to prevent seepage. In these institutions, the changing and emptying of waste vessels was an act of charity, of spiritual service. Nurses and brothers, sometimes referred to as infirmerers, would rise early to tend to the most private needs of their patients. They washed their hands in lavender water. They wore aprons, sometimes waxed to resist stains, and they worked in silence, their steps soft, their touch careful. You can imagine one such brother now, his hands wrinkled with age, his eyes gentle. He kneels beside an old man in the corner bed, helping him sit, steadying his back with one hand while positioning the chamber pot with the other. He says nothing, but when he's done, he murmurs a blessing. The pot is emptied outside, into a trench lined with herbs. A handful of lime is tossed after it. The pot is scrubbed in a tub of hot water, and then it is returned clean and warm. In these places, cleanliness wasn't just about smell or health, it was about mercy, about preserving dignity at the end of life, about making the last days of a sick soul gentler. And yet, even here, danger lingered. Leper houses, special institutions set apart for those with skin diseases, most often diagnosed as leprosy, had their own routines. Leprosy, or what was called leprosy then, was feared as highly contagious. Those afflicted were often removed from society entirely, sent to live in leprosaria on the outskirts of towns. The latrines in these places were sometimes separate, distant structures, built far from the main building, with channels to carry waste away. Those too weak to walk were helped by attendants. Some used wheelchairs or crutches. Others had to crawl. The air was often damp, the ground muddy, but the caregivers, few in number, often unpaid, kept on. In some leper hospitals, waste was not removed daily, but collected in covered pits and cleaned periodically. The smell was constant, the risk of infection high, but still there was routine. Water buckets lined the walls. Cloths were washed in boiling water. Spoons and bowls were set aside for individual use, and the most basic principles of hygiene, long before the word existed, were quietly followed. Because in these places, even more than others, dignity mattered. To offer a clean pot, to wash a body with warm cloths, to speak softly and without revulsion. These small acts stood between life and isolation, between fear and compassion. And now let us walk beyond the hospital walls, to the very edge of society, the prisons. In a deep stone cell the air is stale. A single slit in the wall lets in the night breeze, and with it the sounds of faraway footsteps. The prisoner lies curled on a straw pallet. There is a bucket nearby. It has not been emptied in days. Prisoners in the medieval world were rarely given much care. Waste buckets were sometimes their only facility. Some were never cleaned. Others overflowed and ran across the floor. Rats were common. Infection even more so. In the worst cases, prisoners stood ankle-deep in filth, their cries ignored. But not always. In better-run towns, jailers emptied the buckets twice a day. Some offered soap or a cloth to wash. Prisoners were given access to a communal latrine, behaite, rough platform over a trench, and straw to clean themselves. It was still brutal, still dehumanizing. But it was something, and these small differences between horror and discomfort, between pain and tolerability, mattered immensely. In the records of old town councils, you can still find notes. Repair the prison latrine. Purchase new pots for the sick ward. Assign a boy to clean the reredorer. These were not grand reforms. They were patchwork, piecemeal, but they showed a slow, growing awareness. The filth killed. That dignity mattered. That cleanliness, even in its humblest forms, was a kind of grace. Back in the hospital, the candle by the bed has burned down. The nurse dozes in a chair, her arms folded across her lap. A patient stirs. Another coughs once, then settles again. Outside, the stars remain steady, cold and bright over the tiled roofs and timber beams. The latrine trench still steams faintly in the cool air. Somewhere, a pot is emptied. Somewhere, a cloth is folded and set aside for tomorrow. And though the medieval world was never truly clean, not by modern standards, it was full of people who tried, who bent low to scrub a floor, who rinsed a pot for someone too weak to do it themselves, who whispered prayers not just for the soul, but for the body too. Even in waste, there was reverence. Even in filth, there was love. The sky outside your quiet window remains a dark canvas, brushed with the faintest hints of early dawn. Not quite morning, not yet. Just a breathless stillness. You are deep inside that most silent part of the night, when even the birds have yet to stir and the world feels folded in on itself. Like the final hush before a page turns. The air is cooler now. The candle has long since gone out. But within this hush, our journey carries on. Slowly, gently, deeper still. We've walked the halls of monasteries, crouched in the shadows of peasant cottages, stood beside noble close, stools and stooped over buckets in prisons. But tonight, we return to something more elemental. Something beneath all the wooden seats and linen cloths and chattering city drains. Tonight, we turn our attention to the earth itself, the soil that caught it all, absorbed it, remembered it. Because long before latrines were built, and long after some fell into disuse, waste in the medieval world found its final home in the ground. Picture now a medieval garden, not the manicured flower beds of noble courts, but the rough, humming, fertile patch behind a village home. Here, a mother bends low over a row of cabbages. Her hands are stained with dirt, her nails chipped. She hums to herself, occasionally wiping her brow with the corner of her apron. And nearby, her son, a boy of 6 or 7, dumps the contents of a chamber pot into the corner trench. He's done it 100 times, knows where to pour, how to stir the soil a little afterward. It is part of life. Quiet. Unremarkable. The medieval world was nothing if not practical. And waste, human, animal, kitchen, was part of a cycle. What came out went back in. Most homes kept compost pits or dung heaps, tucked away behind fences or walls, shielded by bushes or low stone partitions. They were warm, humming with flies, and deeply valuable. Into them went not just waste from chamber pots and privies, but food scraps, straw, feathers, spoiled vegetables, cracked eggshells, ash from the hearth, and even hair from combs. The pile was turned with a spade, sometimes left to rot over a season, sometimes used fresh, scattered directly over fields or mixed into planting beds, and yes, even human waste. Night soil, it would come to be called later. But in these times it was simply part of life. Not every household had a formal system. Some would carry their waste outside each morning and dump it near the trees or the hedgerow. Others had a shared pit with neighbours. In winter, the piles froze solid. In summer, they swarmed with insects. But the plants loved them. Turnips grew thick and fast. Cabbage leaves unfurled like sails. Beans coiled joyfully along poles. Carrots burrowed deep, drinking from the dark. And for a people who often knew hunger as a regular companion, this mattered. Of course, it wasn't always safe. Waste, especially if handled carelessly, could spread illness. Parasites, bacteria, viruses none could see passed quietly from person to person. But understanding was limited. People spoke of bad air, of curses, of the alignment of stars. They noticed, however, that too much filth near a well made the water bitter, that the child who played in the latrine trench grew thin, that the field, when spread with raw waste too soon, gave a crop that tasted wrong. And so, gradually, habits formed. The wise farmer let the compost rest before spreading it. The careful housewife poured lime into the bucket after emptying it. The cautious abbey assigned specific days for pit cleaning, when the wind was right and the sun was high. In some towns, entire professions formed around this task. The gong farmer, the night man, the dung collector. He came with his cart, his spade, his heavy boots and oiled coat. Often at night, always quietly. He would descend into the cesspit, sometimes chest deep in its contents, shoveling, hauling, breathing through, cloth soaked in vinegar. His work was filthy, yes, but it paid well, better than most unskilled jobs. And when he finished, he carried the waste to the edges of town, where it would be sold, spread, or buried. Not all wanted to see him. Many turned away. But all depended on him. In the countryside, it was different. Each home handled its own. Some families built what we might call dry toilets, wooden seats over soil, with removable pans or trenches that could be cleared with a shovel. Others simply dug a new hole each season. The earth was their ally, patient and deep, and they gave back to it in quiet gratitude. Gardens fed people. Waste fed gardens. It was not spoken of often, but it was understood, and sometimes when the earth had received too much, it protested. Fields failed, wells ran cloudy, streams stank, and so the villagers would move the latrine pit, dig a fresh trench, let the old one rest beneath a layer of ash and straw, and time would do the rest. In monastic gardens, this was an art. The monks knew which herbs grew best in which soil. They rotated plots. They charted the humours of the land. They used waste from the infirmary only after careful treatment, often buried under mulch for weeks. And they wrote these things down in their manuscripts. Quiet knowledge, passed along line by line, and in noble estates the waste was not wasted either. Manor gardens were carefully arranged, not just for beauty, but for utility. Potages, herb beds, medicinal plants, fruit trees. Somewhere behind the stable, a dung heap rose in careful layers. A servant saw to it. Another servant watched him, and the steward watched them both. Everything was counted. Everything had a use, even filth. Even the bucket of waste from the countess's chamber. Even the scraps from the feast. And in winter, when the ground froze and nothing would grow, and the smell of decay faded, these pits sat like sleeping animals, quiet, waiting. The snow softened their edges, the frost silenced their hum. And beneath the surface, a slow alchemy continued. Then spring would come, the frost would melt, the soil would steam, and the peasants would dig, bare-handed, into the warmed earth. You imagine now a woman kneeling in such a garden. Her hands press into the soft muck. She plants onion bulbs, one after another. Her movements slow but sure. She does not mind the smell. She has lived this cycle all her life. She knows that the same ground receiving waste today will give her soup in a month. Her children's hands will dip bread into that soup. Her husband will nod his thanks, his belly full. She will not think of the latrine as she eats, and later, when the chamber pot is full again, she will carry it outside without comment. Because this is what people did, not because they wanted to, but because it worked, because they saw the earth as part of their home, not clean, not dirty, just necessary, and because, in their own quiet way, they believed in balance. Give the land your waste, let it rest. Receive its gift, then begin again. The edges of the sky are beginning to lighten, barely, gently, as though the night is exhaling at last. That deep stillness holds, but something in it has shifted. A softness, the faintest breath of cool morning. You remain nestled in quietude, still drifting, still suspended in that space between sleep and awareness. And so we stay with the story a while longer, unhurried, tracing the last winding threads of this strangely intimate journey. We've walked through latrines and lingered, near cesspits, crouched by hedges, and carried buckets through kitchens and courtyards. But now we arrive at one of the most peculiar and enduring spaces in the medieval toilet story. The castle garderobe, stone against skin, wind through narrow slits, the clatter of armour just down the hall, and beyond that thick wall, a narrow passage leading to a wooden bench with a hole. Below, a dark drop into emptiness. Sometimes water, sometimes a pit, sometimes just the open air. Welcome to the garderobe. The word sounds elegant, doesn't it? Almost refined. But its origins are humble and layered. In the earliest usage, garderobe meant a place to store garments, a closet of sorts. But in time, it came to refer to the place where one relieved oneself. A place where robes were guarded, oddly enough, by hanging them near the shaft, where the rising ammonia helped keep moths away. Yes, medieval logic, practical and strange. In the thick stone walls of castles, guardrobes were built into turrets or protruding shafts, small, rectangular rooms just large enough to sit in. The opening was typically positioned directly over the moat or the side of the castle wall, allowing waste to drop freely. Some fell into chutes, others into purpose-dug ditches. In water-bound castles, it was sometimes flushed away by the tide or diluted by rain. But rarely, if ever, was it as neat as that sounds. The wind could rise suddenly, whistling upward into the shaft and delivering a rude surprise to the one seated above. Waste could build up in the corners of the stone, requiring servants to clean the shaft manually, sometimes with long-handled scrapers, sometimes with buckets and vinegar. In winter, the stone seat was bitterly cold. In summer, the air could be thick with insects. And yet, it was still considered a luxury. To sit upon stone, alone, high above the ground, was far more pleasant than crouching in a field. Castles had many garderobes, dozens in some cases. The Tower of London once had one for nearly every major chamber, and for kings and queens, special versions existed. Henry III requested a privy chamber with a garret to be built at Clarendon. Edward IV ordered stone seats fitted with hinged lids. These were not only functional, but symbolic, a mark of separation from the common world, where waste was managed out of sight. Some garderobes were linked together, stacked vertically through multiple floors like a medieval plumbing system. Waste from the upper floors dropped through long shafts which might be flushed occasionally with water or cleaned out by assigned labourers. And some castles built what were called murder holes nearby, openings through which boiling water or hot sand could be poured on intruders. In some designs, garderobes doubled as both waste channels and defensive points. Odd, isn't it? That the quietest, most private room in a castle could also be part of its last line of defence. And yet, these spaces were never glamorous, though. The nobility may have dressed in silks and furs. When they visited the garderobe, they became like everyone else. They sat, they relieved themselves, they waited, and they hoped no one was walking below. Servants often stood nearby, ready with cloth, water, or even scented herbs. Some nobles preferred their own personal pot, called a close stool, lined with fine fabric, its lid inlaid with carved ivory or brass. These stools were kept in the bedchamber and carried away discreetly after each use. But the waste had to go somewhere, and so, again, it fell to the invisible hands of servants. The groom of the stool became a real position, a high-ranking one in fact, assigned to care for the monarch's toileting needs. He was trusted, valued, and often privy to private conversation. His duties included preparing the seat, handing cloth, and managing cleanliness. It sounds shocking now, but in the royal court, where privacy was scarce and the king's health a matter of state, it was a position of enormous intimacy. Still, not all castles were equal. Smaller keeps had simpler arrangements: a wooden board, a shaft over a pit, a curtain if you were lucky. Many garderobes drained into a cesspool, often built below the foundations, and when that pool filled, someone had to empty it. Workers lowered themselves by rope into the chamber, lanterns flickering, breath shallow. They scooped and lifted and dumped it into carts. The smell seeped into the walls. The flies lingered for days. But it was necessary. The castles were fortresses, but they were also homes, and like any home, they required care, scraping floors, hauling water, scrubbing garderobes with herbs and ash and hope. You can imagine it now. The sound of a maid emptying a close stool into a larger pot, humming to herself, or the rustle of a noblewoman's gown as she steps carefully into a garderobe, holding her train above the floor, or the clatter of boots on stone as a servant carries a sloshing bucket down the spiral stairwell towards the courtyard. It is not romantic, but it is real, and behind every story of sword and crown, of banquet and battle, were these unseen acts, the quiet maintenance of humanity, and as always, attempts at comfort. Some castle garderobes had padded seats, others had footrests, a few even had small windows, letting in fresh air or moonlight. Tapestries hung nearby to catch the draught. Shelves held folded cloth or sweet-smelling rushes, because even in this cold stone chamber, someone tried to make it bearable. To soften the experience, to honour the body, even as it emptied itself. And so the garderobe, that small hollow room between worlds, became a symbol of medieval life in miniature. Stone and shadow, luxury and filth, isolation and effort. Not quite indoors, not quite outside, but always necessary. And now, as you rest there in the soft fold of night, you can imagine it all. The cold, stone seat warmed by morning sun, the hush of footsteps down a corridor, the splash of water in a wooden basin. Another day has ended, another pot has been emptied, another shaft has been scrubbed, and still the story of waste endures. Humble, human, and utterly timeless, the veil of night has thinned now, barely clinging to the sky. A pale silver hush rests over rooftops and hillsides, and the first birds, tentative and sleepy, have begun to stretch their voices into the waking air. But here in this calm space, your breath slow, your limbs still, we remain in that liminal time, between darkness and light. No need to rise yet, no need to stir. There is still one final chapter to unfold in this quiet story of waste, water, and weary bodies. So far, we've journeyed through castles and cottages, fields and festivals, prisons, churches and hospitals. We've crouched, carried, and carefully emptied. But for our final stop, we turn not to a place, but to a question. What happened when it all became too much? When the pits overflowed? When the drains clogged? When the air turned sour and people began to fall ill, one by one? In the Middle Ages, cleanliness was always a negotiation, a compromise between necessity and possibility. But there were, moments when the fragile balance tipped and the filth took over. Moments when the smell could no longer be ignored, when the streets ran slick, when people whispered of punishment from the heavens. One such moment came in the form of plague. Tititur, Black Death, the great mortality, the silent, invisible scourge that swept across Europe in the 14th century, carried by fleas, by rats, by breath and fear and fate. It killed fast, it killed quietly, and it made filth undeniable. Before the plague, cities were already struggling. Waste collected faster than it could be cleared. Open sewers spilled over in rain. Latrines collapsed. Wells grew foul. People lived cheek by jowl in cramped tenements. Chamber pots emptied from upper windows with no warning below. And when the sickness came, it fed on this mess. Doctors and scholars looked for answers. They blamed the stars. They blamed the Jews. They blamed the winds. But some looked downward. They noticed that the sickness flourished in the poorest quarters, where the drains were clogged and pigs roamed freely. They noticed that clean air towns fared better, that people who burned rosemary or kept windows open sometimes survived. And so slowly, a new awareness began to spread. Cities began to legislate waste, not in theory, but with vigour, real urgency. In London, citizens were fined for dumping filth into the street. In Paris, carts were ordered to remove waste weekly. In Florence, cesspits were mapped and tracked. In Venice, laws were passed prohibiting latrines from being placed too close to canals. Suddenly, the location of a toilet became political. Engineers were hired. Ditches were dug. Water was channeled. Some cities began using aqueducts, not just for drinking water, but for flushing. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. The water was inconsistent. The laws were loosely enforced, and many people continued to live exactly as before. But the seed had been planted. That cleanliness was not just a comfort. It was survival, that a full pit could be a death sentence, that the flow of waste could determine the fate of a neighbourhood, or even an entire city. And in the wake of plague, new ideas began to bloom. Guilds formed of tanners, butchers, and waste workers, each tasked with controlling their share of the mess. New occupations emerged: pit cleaners, barrel collectors, street sweepers, disinfectors. In places like Nuremberg and Bruges, records show a surprising degree of organization: maps, schedules, routes for waste carts, permits to dig new trenches. Some cities even built public latrines, real ones, open to all, cleaned regularly, inspected. They were still rudimentary, of course. Wooden seats, cold water, a broom in the corner, but they existed. And more than that, they represented something new. An acknowledgement that filth was not merely a private burden, but a shared one. That the chamber pot, the trench, the bucket in the corner, these were not just personal inconveniences, but pieces of a collective puzzle. That sanitation, in its earliest medieval form, was not about perfection. It was about peace. Peace of body, peace of community, and yes, peace of mind. Because, as strange as it may seem, there is something deeply human in all of this. In the way people carried their pots with dignity. In the way they folded their cloths just so. In the way they whispered apologies for the smell and tried anyway. There was grace in those gestures. The medieval world may have lacked plumbing. It may have teetered on the edge of illness and decay, but it was never indifferent. People tried. They cleaned with vinegar and hope. They burned herbs to sweeten the air. They taught their children how to use the latrine without falling in. They wrote prayers for healing. They posted laws about sewage. They scolded their neighbours for dumping too close to the well. And in all these small, repetitive acts, they built the beginnings of something bigger. Something that would one day become sanitation. And so, here at the end of our slow, strange, and thoroughly earthy journey, we rest in the knowledge that even in the filthiest corners of the past, there was effort, there was thought, there was care. There were servants scrubbing stone in cold dawn light. There were mothers teaching dignity to daughters. There were monks measuring compost piles. There were gong farmers up to their elbows in the city's sins, scraping out space for something cleaner to come. You, dear listener, have walked through it all. Past the buzzing flies and swaying rushes, past the clatter of buckets and the groan of overflowing pits, past the giggles of children learning to go, and the sighs of old men whose knees could no longer bend. You've seen the world from the underside, and now, perhaps, you see it differently. Not with disgust, but with wonder, because to build a civilization, one must first know how to keep it clean. And though they lacked our tools, our words, our science, those quiet medieval folk laid the foundation, stone by stone, bucket by bucket, flush by future flush. And now, as the soft light of morning touches the far horizon, our time in this peculiar history draws to a close. The last pot has been emptied, the last cloth folded, the last shaft swept clean. The garderobes are quiet, the trenches are still, and the world waits freshly scrubbed for whatever may come next. Rest now, gentle soul, you've earned it. And thus, as the night gives way to morning, our journey through the world of medieval toilets comes to its end. Thank you for walking with me. Step by humbling step, sleep well.